Professor Bernburg is here. Professor, let's stick with history for the last couple of questions. How did Islam develop in the last 300 years, let's say, from the 18th century in Europe?
Well, it developed mostly not in Europe, but in, let's say, in the territory of the Ottoman Empire and the adjacent empires, the Iran, and then, of course, India. You know, one of my historical observations that I insist on making repeatedly is that in the 18th century, in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula, you had the beginnings of what we now have as Wahhabism, as the Saudi brand of Islam. Now, the development of Wahhabism, Wahhabism originally was a term of abuse, you know, because the founder, the religious founder, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, you know, Abd al-Wahhab, of course, means the servant of the all-giving, which is an epithet of God, you know, but it was called Wahhabism, even in Arabic, shortly after. And this Wahhabism has nothing to do with European imperialism, colonialism, etc., etc. It developed on the margins of Arabian Islam, and it developed as a movement, as an alliance between a religious reform, which was extremely intolerant, and a power base, which was provided by the Al Saud, the dynasty which is still ruling in Saudi Arabia, and their tribes, you know. And the characteristic of this movement, it was groups of marginal Muslims, marginal populations, economically marginal, and this combination of religious reform, or what was called reform, with an underprivileged population group, is a model that you can see throughout Islamic history. Even from the sort of very beginnings, or very close to the beginnings of the 7th century, you can see it happening time and again. And you saw it in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula in the 18th century. And what we now have, of course, is a very bad situation. We have so-called petro-Islam, petro because it's funded by petrodollars. And the Saudis have exported their reactionary brand of Islam, funded by the petrodollars, over the entire Islamic world in the last, 30 years or so. And this is a pernicious development that should be checked. And it should have been checked long ago. Now here, of course, Western policies towards Saudi Arabia also are largely to blame. I mean, they are not the root of the problem, but they have magnified the problem because of this accursed oil dependency on oil. The Saudis have been treated with kid gloves, as you say in English. You know, in German it would be velvet gloves. You know, and they shouldn't have been. They should be called to task. And of course, in the so-called oil crises of the 1970s, it should have been clear that highly industrialized countries should make themselves independent from oil, which they didn't do, you know. And I mean, this is a big problem. It's definitely a big problem. You have it everywhere. You have it now in ex-Yugoslavia. You have it in Bosnia. You have it in Central Asia. You have it probably in Turkey. You have it in Arab countries. You have it everywhere. And this is by no means the only problem, but it definitely is a problem. As I said before, it has nothing. Its development, its origins, have nothing to do with Europe or the so-called West. Now, this is one thing that is a very. I mean, you know, in the history of Islamic peoples, of Muslims, from the 7th century, from the time of Muhammad on, you have had a variety of periods. You have had I mean, it couldn't be any other way. You know, you have had periods of great cultural efflorescence, like in the 9th and 10th and 11th Christian centuries. You know, in the 3rd, 4th, 5th Islamic centuries. in some areas you have had it in much later centuries. You have had these great, as an American historian of Islam has called them, gunpowder empires of the early modern period. You know, you had the Ottoman Empire, you had the Safavid Empire, and you had the Mughal Empire in India, the three great empires that were built on firearms. You know, that's why they are called gunpowder empires. And if you look at the 18th century, for instance, or the 17th century rather than the 18th, the Mughal Empire was a state of tremendous power, tremendous wealth, tremendous cultural productivity. You know, and in the Ottoman Empire it looks slightly different. The 17th century was already a period of crisis, and in the 18th century you had the beginning of Westernization. I mean, if you look at Ottoman architecture, for instance, in the 18th century, you already see European Baroque elements there. You know, the Nuru Osmaniye Mosque in Istanbul, for instance, is a very good example. And you had then, from the late 18th century, you had the series of reform movements in the Ottoman Empire. You know, you had Selim III, who was then killed. You know, he failed, and all through the 19th century and all through the period until the First World War, you have a series of Westernizing reform in the Ottoman Empire. Now, the great trouble was, and this is of course an unfortunate legacy of the West, of Europe, is nationalism. I mean, nationalism as it has developed in not only in Europe but also in the Middle East since the 19th and then especially the 20th century has been a great power of destruction. If you look even at the countries of the Fertile Crescent, you know, a reformed Ottoman Empire would have been much better for them than these states that were carved up, you know, by the Western powers after the First World War, you know, and same of course in southeastern Europe. A reformed Habsburg Empire would have been much better for all these countries than what you have had since the First World War, and now. At present, of course, we are in a very critical period in politically speaking, and we talked about the Arab world. I mean, we talked about the Near East, you know, the Fertile Crescent, Syria, you know, Lebanon is in permanent crisis. Yes. Then you have Palestine, Israel, Iraq now.
Kurds and Turkish people as well.
Yes. You know, Ataturk, of course, was only the last chain in the link in the chain of Westernizing reforms in Turkey. The trouble was it was always top down. It was always top down. It was always elitist, you know, and it didn't get enough hold in the broad, you know, population. And it's only going to change for the better if people vote in the light of their own best self-interest, in the light of their own enlightened self-interest. I mean, self-interest as such is not bad. It can be enlightened and it can be bigoted, you know, and everything in between. Now, if I take a sort of broader historical perspective, I would say Muslims, Islam, quote unquote, has always enjoyed periods of prosperity and flowering when it was not governed by very strict and narrow religious norms.
And in history as well, let's say with the Hungarian Ottoman history, I mean, the common saying is that when Ottomans conquered the parts of Austro-Hungary before, that they would force the population there in the villages to convert to Islam. But right now, I mean, it's considered that there was not a religious conflict, but just conquering.
Yes.
For the sake of profit, not for the sake of religion, right?
Well, of course, religion is not an independent variable. religion is always tied to other, aspects, to other, forces in society, and to material interest, and to spiritual interest, and so on and so forth. Now, in general, you see, even in the 7th century, when the first wave of Muslim conquests took place out of the Arabian Peninsula, they usually did not force the subject populations to convert, and so the Hungarian subject population was not, as a rule, forced to convert. It was different under Christian rulers. Stephen the Saint Stephen, or Charlemagne in Germany, they forced their subject populations to convert to Christianity. It was not like that in Islam, but of course it was the Ottoman Empire was built on the principle that the future conquests would pay for the present costs, for the present upkeep. And so when the conquests, the foreign conquests, didn't proceed anymore in the Ottoman Empire, crisis set in, because they couldn't pay the regular costs out of the tax revenue or whatever they had. They would have needed new conquests to pay for their current expenses. And when this system collapsed, crisis set in. Now, on the other hand, in Hungary, of course, the taxable population was under double oppression, because the absentee Hungarian aristocrats also charged taxes from the peasants. So they had to pay taxes twice, to the absentee Hungarian landowners and to the Ottoman government. And that, of course, was not positive at all. And of course, if you look at Mohács, if it hadn't been for the disarming of the populace before that, because of the present rebellion of Doja George, maybe resistance would have been more effective against the Ottomans. I mean, certainly, as far as I can tell, and of course I'm not a specialist in Hungarian history, the Ottoman rule in Hungary was not positive. It didn't have good effects. I mean, in other areas it might have been different, but certainly not in Hungary, as far as I can tell.
Professor, do you think it was a good decision for Ataturk to divide religion from the government, to make the country secular?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, of course, it has developed differently now, but as a principle, religion and the state have to be separate. This is my deep conviction, and not only my conviction; it's the conviction of many people. I mean, politics is a very tricky area, and religion usually gets compromised if it's intimately involved in politics. We see it in Iran, for instance, at present. We see it in other countries. We saw it in Spain. A Frankist Spain. With the Catholic Church being intimately involved in state matters. We see it in Italy. We saw it in Germany. I mean, in different ways. Religion and state have to be separate from each other.
But did his reform have any issues? Because we see right now that more or less the current government is moving away from his.
One of the great weaknesses, as I said before, was this top-down approach. You cannot. Yes, you do need to act top-down in certain moments at certain times, but then you have to try to develop and build support from bottom up. Without that, reforms will remain short-lived.
Thank you for being in Thailand, Professor.
Okay, thank you.
That was it for today. Hope you enjoyed the show, and see you next time.